She had spoken to no one but the wind and her horses for 18 years, building walls higher than the Red Canyon cliffs that surrounded her desert ranch, until a Navajo hunter carrying a dying child stumbled through her gate at sunset. And 4 simple words shattered the fortress she had built around her heart. The sun painted the Arizona territory in shades of copper and gold as it began its descent toward the jagged horizon, casting long shadows across the stone ranch that stretched for 3,000 acres of high desert. Rebecca Stone stood on the covered porch of her adobe house, her weathered hands gripping a cup of bitter coffee, while her gray eyes surveyed the land that had become both her kingdom and her prison.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
At 52, Becca had the kind of lean strength that came from 18 years of doing men's work in a country that showed no mercy to the weak. Her auburn hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in a practical bun that hadn't seen a mirror's vanity in years. Her clothes were functional men's denims, a cotton shirt faded from countless washings, and boots that had walked more miles than most people traveled in a lifetime. The only jewelry she wore was her wedding ring, a simple gold band she couldn't bring herself to remove despite the fact that her husband had been dead nearly 2 decades. The stone ranch sat in a natural bowl between towering red mesas, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through Devil's Canyon for 12 treacherous miles before reaching the nearest settlement of Copper Creek. It was isolation by design, chosen by Becca and her husband William in 1867 when they were young and believed that love could conquer the harshest landscape. They had been wrong about many things, but the land had proven as enduring as their love had been brief. William Stone had been a dreamer, full of plans for raising cattle and horses in this protected valley where natural springs provided year-round water, and the high walls kept out the worst of the desert storms. For 8 years, they had worked side by side, building their house from adobe bricks they made themselves, digging irrigation ditches, breaking horses, and slowly accumulating a herd that thrived in the desert grasslands. Becca had been pregnant 3 times during those years, but the desert had claimed each child before they could draw their first breath outside her womb. Then came the Apache raid in the spring of 1875. William had been working alone in the South pasture when Gray Wolf's band swept down from the mountains, seeking horses to replace those lost in their running war with the cavalry. The warriors took 30 of their best horses and left William's body sprawled in the dirt, his blood soaking into the earth he had loved so desperately. Becca found him at sunset, coyotes already circling, and something inside her had died with him in that moment. She buried William on the hill behind the house, under a lone mesquite tree that somehow thrived in the rocky soil. The marker was simple, a wooden cross with his name burned into the crosspiece, and the dates of his too short life. She had stood at that grave for hours after the burial, waiting for tears that never came, waiting for the crushing grief that others spoke of. Instead, she felt only a vast emptiness, as if her emotions had been carved out with a dull knife. The years that followed had blurred into a routine of survival. Becca kept the ranch running through sheer stubbornness and the practical skills that frontier life had beaten into her. She learned to brand cattle, repair windmills, and shoot straight enough to drop a coyote at 200 yards. She traded with the few honest ranchers in Copper Creek, selling horses and beef when she needed supplies, but never staying in town longer than necessary. People made her uncomfortable now. Their sympathetic looks and well-meaning questions felt like probes into wounds that had never properly healed. The ranch hands had drifted away within a year of William's death, some seeking work elsewhere, others unwilling to take orders from a woman, no matter how capable. Becca didn't try to replace them. She preferred the company of her horses and cattle, animals that demanded nothing but food, water, and competent care. They didn't ask about her feelings or suggest she might be happier in town. They simply accepted her presence and got on with the business of living. By 1893, Becca Stone had become something of a legend in the territory. The hermit woman who ran 3,000 acres single-handed, who could outcuss a cavalry sergeant and outshoot most men who had turned her back on civilization and chosen the harsh embrace of the desert over human companionship. Children in Copper Creek whispered stories about her, claiming she could talk to animals and that her eyes could freeze a man's blood in his veins. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than the stories. She was just a woman who had loved too deeply and lost too much, and had decided that solitude was safer than risking her heart again. Her daily routine had become as fixed as the sunrise. She rose before dawn to check on the livestock, spending the morning hours repairing whatever the desert had damaged overnight. Afternoons were for writing the boundaries of her land, checking for breaks in the fence line or signs of predators. Evenings she spent on the porch, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of fire while she planned the next day's work. She spoke aloud sometimes, addressing comments to her horse or the ancient cottonwood tree that shaded the house. But these weren't conversations so much as the practical observations of someone who had grown comfortable with her own voice as the only response she could expect. The house itself had evolved to suit a woman living alone. The parlor that had once been arranged for entertaining guests now served as a workshop where she repaired tack and cleaned her rifles. The dining room table was covered with account books, correspondence with cattle buyers, and the various papers that came with running a business. The kitchen remained functional but showed no signs of cooking for more than one person. Meals were simple affairs: beans, hardtack, jerky, coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. She had forgotten how to cook for pleasure, how to make food that was meant to be shared. The bedroom she had shared with William remained exactly as it had been the morning he rode out to check the south pasture for the last time. His clothes still hung in the wardrobe, his razor lay on the washstand, his books were stacked on the knitstand where he had left them. Becca slept in the small room they had intended for their first child, on a narrow bed that suited a woman who had trained herself not to reach across empty space in her sleep. On this particular evening in late September, something felt different about the desert's mood. Becca had learned to read the land's subtle signs during her years of solitude, and tonight the usual tranquility seemed strained, as if the very air were holding its breath. The horses in the corral were restless, snorting and pacing along the fence line, with their ears pricked toward the mouth of the canyon. Even Old Thunder, her statiest gelding, was dancing sideways and rolling his eyes at shadows that shouldn't have spooked a seasoned cow horse. She set down her coffee cup and walked to the edge of the porch, her hand automatically checking the position of the Colt revolver on her hip. Living alone in Apache country had taught her that paranoia was often the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming food for the buzzards. The desert had its own language of danger, and tonight it was speaking in a dialect she recognized, but couldn't quite interpret. The wind had shifted sometime during the afternoon, bringing with it the scent of distant rain and something else: smoke, but not the familiar smell of a campfire or a grass fire set by lightning. This was different, carrying undertones that made her think of burned structures and scattered belongings. Someone had suffered a disaster recently, and not too far from her hidden valley. In the Arizona territory, disaster usually came with war paint and feathered lances, or with the glint of badges and the promise of justice delivered at gunpoint. Becca climbed the wooden ladder to the flat roof of her house, a habit she had developed during the early years when Apache raids were more frequent. From this vantage point, she could see the entire approach through Devil's Canyon, the winding trail that served as the only route to her ranch. The sun had nearly set, painting the canyon walls in deepening shades of red and purple, but she could still make out the shapes of rocks and scrub brush that marked the familiar landscape. She was about to climb back down when movement caught her eye. Far down the canyon, perhaps 2 miles away, A figure was moving along the trail with the distinctive gait of someone traveling on foot.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Even at this distance, she could tell it was a man and that he was carrying something or someone in his arms. He moved with the economical stride of someone accustomed to covering long distances, but there was something labored about his progress that suggested exhaustion or injury. Becca's first instinct was to go inside, bar the door, and wait for the stranger to pass by. In 18 years of solitude, she had perfected the art of being invisible when unwanted visitors approached. But as she watched, the figure stumbled and nearly fell, catching himself with obvious effort before continuing his slow progress toward her ranch. Whatever drove him to keep moving despite his exhaustion, it was something more powerful than ordinary need. She climbed down from the roof and went inside to retrieve her spyglass, a cavalry telescope William had traded for years ago. Back on the porch, she focused the lens on the approaching figure and felt her breath catch in her throat. The man was Navajo, she could tell by his clothing and the way he carried himself. But he was far from any reservation land and traveling alone except for the burden in his arms. As he drew closer, she could see that he was carrying a child, a small figure wrapped in what looked like a blanket or hide. The Navajo was tall and lean, with the kind of fluid movement that marked him as someone equally at home on foot or horseback. His black hair was pulled back in the traditional style, and he wore a mixture of native and white man's clothing, deerskin leggings, a cotton shirt that might have come from a trading post, and a hat that had seen better days. Most significantly, he carried no weapons that she could see, unusual for any man traveling alone in hostile country. As the distance between them closed, Becca could make out more details that troubled her. The child in the man's arms appeared to be unconscious, hanging limp despite the motion of walking. The Navajo's face, visible now in the fading light, showed the kind of desperate determination that came from having no choices left. Whatever had brought him to her isolated canyon, it wasn't a casual visit or a search for easy pickings from a woman living alone. By the time the stranger reached the gate of her ranch yard, full darkness had fallen and Becca had lit the lanterns. On her porch, she stood in the yellow circle of light, her rifle held casually but ready, watching as the Navajo stopped just outside the split-rail fence that marked the boundary of her domestic space. He looked up at her with eyes that reflected the lantern light like polished obsidian, and she could see the exhaustion etched in every line of his face. For a long moment, they studied each other across the fence that represented more than just a boundary between her property and the open desert. It was the line between her carefully constructed solitude and the dangerous world of human need and obligation that she had spent 18 years avoiding. The child in his arms stirred weakly, and in that small movement, Becca saw the collapse of every wall she had built around her heart. "My name is Ahiga Bege," the man said in English that carried only the slightest accent, his voice rough with thirst and exhaustion. "This is my son Bidziel. He is very sick, and I have been traveling for 3 days to find help. The trading post at Copper Creek said there was a woman here who knew about healing." Becca's grip tightened on her rifle. The trading post in Copper Creek knew better than to send strangers to her ranch, especially strangers seeking help she had no intention of providing. "You were misinformed," she said, her voice carrying the harsh edge of someone unused to conversation. "I'm no healer. You need to keep moving." Ahiga adjusted his grip on the child, and Becca could see the tremor in his arms that spoke of muscles pushed beyond their limits. "Please," he said, and the words seemed torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Look at him. Just look at him," despite every instinct screaming at her to turn away. Becca found herself focusing on the small figure in the stranger's arms. The child Bidziel appeared to be perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with the delicate features that often marked children who had been fighting illness for a long time. His face was flushed with fever, and even from her position on the porch, she could see the rapid, shallow breathing that suggested his body was losing the battle against whatever sickness had claimed him. What's wrong with him? She heard herself ask, the question emerging despite her determination to remain uninvolved. Lung fever, Ahiga replied. It started as a cold, but it has gotten worse each day. The medicine man of our people did what he could, but the boy needs white man's medicine now. The doctor in Flagstaff said he needed to get to cooler air, away from the desert heat, and rest in a place where he could breathe clean water steam. He paused, swaying slightly on his feet. The man at the trading post said you had a place with good water, high up where the air is different. Becca's mind raced through the implications of what he was asking. Copper Creek's trading post was run by Ben Matthews, a man who had known her since before William's death. Ben was one of the few people who remembered that she had once helped birth babies and tend the sick when Copper Creek was too small to support a real doctor. That had been another life, another version of herself that she had buried along with her husband and her unborn children. I don't do that anymore, she said firmly. Haven't for years. You need to take him to the doctor in Flagstaff. The doctor in Flagstaff is the one who sent us here, Ahiga replied, his voice beginning to show cracks of desperation. He said the boy would not survive the journey to the hospital in Phoenix or Tucson. He said if we could find a place in the high country with good water and someone who understood lung sickness, that might be his only chance. The child stirred again, making a sound that was part whimper, part cough, and Becca felt something twist in her chest that she had thought was dead and buried. She had heard that sound before, from children whose mothers had begged her for help in the early days of Copper Creek. Most of the time, she had been able to help. Sometimes she had not. The failures had haunted her dreams until she stopped trying altogether. Why didn't you go to the reservation? She asked, grasping for any reason to turn them away. Surely your own people would take you in. Ahiga's face hardened slightly. My wife was not Navajo. She was Mexican, from Sonora. When she died last winter, some of the people said Bidziel was not truly one of us. They would not turn us away, but they would not go out of their way to save a half-breed child either. The bitterness in his voice was carefully controlled, but Becca could hear the pain underneath. I will not let my son die because some people cannot see past the color of his mother's skin. The honesty of the statement hit Becca like a physical blow. She understood something about being an outsider, about being judged by people who had never walked in your boots or slept under your stars. The difference was that she had chosen her isolation, while this man and his child were having it forced upon them by prejudice and circumstance. May we rest here tonight? Ahiga asked, and those 4 simple words carried the weight of a father's love and desperation. I am not asking you to cure him. I am asking for a place where he can lie down somewhere warm and dry, where he can drink clean water and breathe air that doesn't taste of dust and death. If you turn us away, we will go, but he will not live to see another sunrise. Becca looked down at the child in his father's arms, and for a moment she saw not a stranger's sick boy, but the ghost of every child she might have had, every patient she had failed to save, every moment of connection she had denied herself in the years since William's death. The desert wind moved through the canyon with a sound like whispered prayers, and she realized she was standing at a crossroad she had been avoiding for 18 years. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, filled with the weight of decision and the soft sound of the child's labored breathing. Becca could feel the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone asked her to care about their pain, to open herself to the possibility of loss and failure. For 18 years she had protected herself by simply saying no, by turning away from human need and human connection. It had kept her safe, but it had also kept her empty. I told you, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. I'm not a healer anymore. I wouldn't know where to start. You know how to boil water, Ahiga replied simply. You know how to make a place warm and clean. You know how to show kindness to someone who needs it. That is more healing than many doctors can provide." Becca stared at him, recognizing something in his face that she had seen in her own mirror for years. The look of someone who had lost everything that mattered and was now facing the possibility of losing even more. The difference was that he was still fighting, still willing to humble himself before a stranger, if it meant a chance to save what remained of his world. "The nearest real doctor is 2 days' ride," she said, and even as she spoke, she knew. She was looking for reasons to justify what her heart was already deciding. "If the boy is as sick as you say, he wouldn't survive the journey." "No," Ahiga agreed. "He would not." The child made another of those heartbreaking sounds, a whisper of breath that spoke of systems beginning to fail, and Becca felt the last of her defenses crumble. She thought of William, of how he would have reacted to a scene like this. Her husband had never met a stranger he wouldn't help, never turned away from someone in need. It was one of the things she had loved most about him, and one of the things that had made his loss so devastating. "Damn you," she whispered, though whether she was cursing Ahiga, herself, or the circumstances that had brought them together, she couldn't have said. She stepped off the porch and walked to the gate, her boots crunching on the gravel path. "Bring him inside." Ahiga's relief was visible even in the dim light. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will not forget this kindness." "Save your thanks," Becca replied, unlatching the gate with hands that trembled slightly. "I haven't done anything yet except let you inside. The boy might die anyway, and then you'll hate me for giving you false hope. Hope is not false if it leads to action," Ahiga said, following her toward the house. "My son has a chance now. Whatever comes, it is more than he had an hour ago." Becca led them into the kitchen, the heart of her adobe house, where a fire still glowed in the big stone fireplace, and the air held the lingering warmth of the day's cooking. She quickly cleared the long wooden table that dominated the room, sweeping aside account books and correspondence to make space for the child. "Lay him here," she said, spreading a clean quilt over the scarred wood. "I need to see what we're dealing with." Ahiga gently placed his son on the improvised bed, and in the better light of the kitchen, Becca could see just how serious the child's condition had become. Bidziel's skin had the waxy pallor that spoke of high fever and dehydration, and the blue tinge around his lips indicated that his lungs were not getting enough air into his blood. His breathing was rapid and shallow, with a rattling quality that she recognized from her early days of tending the sick. She pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the heat radiating from his small body like a banked fire. His pulse was fast and thready, racing to compensate for his body's failing systems. She had seen children recover from lung fever, but she had also seen them die, and Bidziel was closer to the latter category than she cared to admit. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, already moving toward the shelves where she kept her limited medical supplies. 3 days, Ahiga replied. "Maybe 4. The fever came on quickly after we left the reservation. I thought it was just the heat of travel, but it has only gotten worse." Becca nodded grimly. Lung fever could kill quickly in children, especially those who were already weakened by stress and poor nutrition. The fact that Bidziel had survived this long spoke to his fundamental strength, but that strength was failing fast. "I'll need to get him cooled down and get some fluids into him," she said, falling back on half-remembered procedures from her past life as an unofficial healer. "After that, we'll try to ease his breathing and hope his body can fight off whatever infection has settled in his lungs." She moved through her kitchen with growing confidence, muscle memory taking over as she gathered the supplies she would need. Clean cloths, a basin for cool water, the precious bottle of whiskey she kept for emergencies, willow bark tea for fever, and the collection of herbs she had continued to grow and dry despite her withdrawal from healing work. As she worked, She became aware of Ahiga, watching her every movement with the intensity of a man whose child's life hung in the balance. She could feel the weight of his hope and desperation, the terrible responsibility of being someone's last chance. It was a feeling she had forgotten, and one she had sworn never to experience again. "This doesn't mean I'm back in the healing business," she said without looking at him, needing to establish boundaries even as she crossed them. "This is just one night, one child. After he's better, if he gets better, you'll need to find somewhere else to go." "I understand," Ahiga replied quietly. One night might be all we need, but even as Becca began the familiar rituals of tending the sick, she suspected that this night would change everything. The walls she had built around her heart for 18 years were already showing cracks, and she had a feeling that by morning, they might be broken beyond repair. While she prepared the kitchen for what might be a night-long battle against death, she moved with the efficiency of someone whose muscle memory was awakening after years of dormancy, pulling down ceramic bowls, laying out clean towels, and stoking the fire until the flames cast dancing shadows on the adobe walls. The familiar rhythm of preparation felt both foreign and natural, like speaking a language she had once known fluently, but hadn't used in years. When Ahiga returned with 2 buckets of cold well water, she had him help her strip Bidzil down to his underclothes, revealing a small body that was far too thin for a child his age. The boy's ribs showed clearly through his skin, and his arms and legs had the wasted look of someone who had been fighting illness for longer than his father had admitted. Dark circles under his closed eyes spoke of sleepless nights and pain that no child should have to endure. "When did he last eat?" Becca asked, soaking a cloth in the cool water and beginning to bathe the child's fevered skin. "Yesterday morning," Ahiga replied, his voice tight with worry. "Maybe the morning before. He has not been able to keep much down for several days." Becca nodded grimly. Dehydration and malnutrition would make it much harder for Bidzil to fight off the infection that was ravaging his small body. She had seen too many children die not from the original illness, but from the weakness that came when they couldn't eat or drink enough to maintain their strength. The next few hours would determine whether this boy had enough reserves left to survive. She worked methodically, cooling his burning skin with damp cloths while simultaneously preparing a weak broth from beef bones she'd been saving for soup. The kitchen filled with the rich smell of simmering marrow and herbs, a scent that seemed to bring life back to a space that had been merely functional for too many years. As she worked, she found herself humming under her breath an old lullaby her mother had sung when Becca was small and frightened. "You have done this before," Ahiga observed, watching her hands move with practiced certainty as she checked the child's pulse and breathing. "Many times, a long time ago," Becca replied, not wanting to talk about the years when she had been known throughout the territory as someone who could coax life back into failing bodies. "Before I learned that sometimes caring isn't enough," Ahiga was quiet for a moment, then said, "My wife used to say that caring was always enough, even when it could not prevent death." She said the caring itself was the victory, not the outcome. The simple wisdom of the statement caught Becca off guard. She looked up from her patient to study Ahiga's face in the firelight, seeing the kind of deep sadness that only came from losing someone who had been the center of your world. "What happened to her?" she asked gently. "The coughing sickness," Ahiga replied. "Last winter, when the snows were deep and the medicine man could not travel to our hogan. She fought it for weeks, getting weaker each day, but she would not give up because she said Bidzil needed her." His voice cracked slightly. "In the end, her body gave up even though her spirit did not want to leave us." Becca felt something twist in her chest, recognizing the particular agony of watching someone you love slip away, despite your desperate efforts to save them. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it in a way that surprised her with its intensity. "She made me promise to take care of our son," Ahiga continued, "to fight for him the way she had fought. That is why I have traveled so far, why I am begging strangers for help. I cannot break that promise." The raw honesty of his words stripped away another layer of the protective armor Becca had built around her heart. She turned back to Bidziel, whose breathing had become slightly less labored since they had begun, cooling his fever, and found herself making the kind of commitment she had sworn never to make again. "We'll get him through this," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. Whatever it takes. As the night deepened and the desert outside grew cold, the kitchen became a world unto itself, lit by firelight and oil lamps, filled with the quiet sounds of healing work. Becca found herself falling back into routines she had thought were buried forever, checking the child's pulse every few minutes, adjusting the damp claws on his forehead, coaxing spoonfuls of broth between his cracked lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. Ahiga proved to be an ideal assistant, anticipating what she needed before she asked for it, holding his son steady when she needed to examine him more closely, never getting in the way but always ready to help. He had the calm competence of someone who had dealt with medical emergencies before, and Becca found herself wondering what other losses he had endured in his life. Around midnight, Bidziel's fever spiked again, sending his small body into convulsions that left him gasping and disoriented. Becca worked frantically to cool him down, packing ice chips around his body while Ahiga held him steady, both of them fighting the kind of panic that came when death seemed to be winning. For several terrifying minutes, the child's breathing became so shallow that Becca thought they had lost him. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the crisis passed. Bidziel's breathing deepened, his body relaxed, and when Becca checked his temperature, she found that the fever had finally begun to break. The relief she felt was so intense it left her shaking, and she had to sit down heavily in the chair beside the table to steady herself. "Is he going to be all right?" Ahiga asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think so," Becca replied, though she was almost afraid to say the words out loud. "The fever's breaking, and his breathing is getting stronger. If we can keep getting fluids into him and let him rest, he should recover." Ahiga closed his eyes and said something in Navajo that sounded like a prayer of thanksgiving. When he opened them again, there were tears on his cheeks that he made no effort to hide. "I thought I was going to lose him too," he said simply. "You didn't," Becca replied, reaching over to check Bidziel's pulse again. "He's a fighter, this one. Takes after his father, I imagine." The compliment seemed to surprise Ahiga. "You do not know me well enough to say that." "I know enough," Becca said, settling back in her chair as exhaustion began to catch up with her. "I know you walked for days carrying this sick child, looking for help from people who had no reason to trust you or care about your problems. I know you humbled yourself before a stranger, because your son's life was more important than your pride. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man you are." Ahiga was quiet for a long moment, seeming to struggle with emotions he couldn't quite express. Finally he said, "You saved his life tonight. I will never forget that." "We saved his life," Becca corrected. "You got him here, and you didn't give up when most people would have. That matters just as much as anything I did." As the words left her mouth, Becca realized how long it had been since she had felt the satisfaction that came from working alongside someone toward a common goal. For 18 years she had done everything alone, making every decision by herself, bearing every burden without help or companionship. Tonight, for the first time since William's death, she had remembered what it felt like to be part of a team. The first light of dawn was creeping through the kitchen windows when Bidziel finally opened his eyes and looked around with something approaching awareness. His fever had broken completely during the night, and though he was still weak and disoriented, there was a clarity in his gaze that had been absent when his father first carried him through Becca's gate. "Where am I?" he asked in a voice that was barely audible but wonderfully clear. "You are safe," Ahiga said, leaning over to smooth his son's hair back from his forehead. "This is Mrs. Stone's house. She helped you get better." Bidziel turned his head to look at Becca, studying her with the direct, unguarded curiosity that only children possessed. "Are you a medicine woman?" he asked. "No," Becca replied, surprising herself by smiling. "I'm just someone who knows how to take care of sick people. How do you feel?" "Tired," Bidziel admitted. "And thirsty. My throat hurts. That's to be expected," Becca said, reaching for a cup of water. "You've been very sick, but you're going to be fine now. Can you drink a little of this?" She helped him sit up enough to sip from the cup, and the sight of him drinking on his own was more satisfying than anything she had experienced in years. Color was already beginning to return to his cheeks, and his breathing had lost the frightening rattle that had marked his illness. "I'm hungry," Bidziel announced after he had finished the water. Ahiga laughed, the sound rich with relief and joy. "That is the best thing I have heard in days. When you are hungry, I know you are getting well." Becca found herself smiling again as she moved to prepare something light for the child to eat. "I think I can manage some eggs and toast. Nothing too heavy until your stomach gets used to food." Again, as she cooked, she became aware of Ahiga and Bidziel talking quietly in Navajo, their voices carrying the comfortable rhythms of a father and son who loved each other deeply. The sound filled the kitchen with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and Becca found herself listening not to the words, which she couldn't understand, but to the emotional music underneath them. "Mrs. Stone," Bidziel said suddenly, switching back to English, "my father says you live here all by yourself. Don't you get lonely?" The direct question, asked with a child's complete lack of guile, caught Becca off guard. She paused in her cooking, unsure how to answer. "Sometimes," she said finally. "But I have my animals and my work keeps me busy. That's not the same as having people," Bidziel observed with the devastating honesty that children specialized in. "People are better than animals for talking to, Bidziel," Ahiga said gently. "It is not polite to ask personal questions." "It's all right," Becca said, though the child's words had hit closer to home than she cared to admit. "He's not wrong. People are better for talking to. I just forgot how to talk to them for a while. You're talking to us just fine," Bidziel pointed out reasonably. "Yes," Becca agreed, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. "I suppose I am," as she watched the child eat with an appetite that proved his recovery was well underway. Becca found herself thinking about the conversation in ways that were both uncomfortable and necessary. For 18 years, she had told herself that isolation was a choice, that she preferred solitude to the complications that came with human relationships. But listening to a sick child's simple observation about the value of companionship, she began to wonder if she had been lying to herself about what she actually wanted. After Bidziel had eaten and fallen back into the natural sleep of recovery, rather than the fevered unconsciousness of illness, Becca and Ahiga found themselves sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, sharing coffee and the kind of comfortable silence that sometimes develops between people who have worked together through a crisis. "Tell me about your ranch," Ahiga said eventually. "It must be hard work, managing so much land alone." "It is," Becca admitted, "but it's work I understand. Cattle and horses don't lie to you, or disappoint you, or leave you when you need them most. They're predictable in a way that people never are." "That sounds like something someone says when people have hurt them," Ahiga observed gently. Becca looked at him sharply, but there was no judgment in his expression, only the kind of understanding that came from someone who had experienced his own share of pain. "Maybe," she said carefully. "My wife used to say that trust in people was like planting seeds in the desert," Ahiga continued. "Most of the time, nothing grows, and you think you are foolish for trying. But sometimes, when the conditions are right, something beautiful springs up that makes all the failures worthwhile." "And what do you think about that philosophy now that she's gone?" Becca asked, hearing the edge in her own voice. "I think she was right," Ahiga replied simply. "The fact that I lost her does not make the years we had together any less precious." The pain of losing someone you love is the price you pay for having loved them at all. The simple wisdom of his words hit Becca like a physical blow. She had spent 18 years trying to convince herself that the pain of losing William meant their love had been a mistake, that isolation was safer than risking her heart again. But listening to Ahiga talk about his wife, she realized that she had been carrying her grief like a shield, using it to protect herself from the possibility of feeling anything ever again. "How do you do it?" she asked quietly. "How do you keep going, keep trusting, after losing someone who meant everything to you?" "I look at my son," Ahiga said, glancing toward the sleeping child, "and I remember that she lives on in him, in the love she gave him, in the lessons she taught him. Her death was an ending, but it was not the only thing that mattered about her life." Becca felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had shed in years. "I don't have children to carry on what William and I had together. When he died, it all died with him, did it?" Ahiga asked gently. "Or did you bury it along with him because it was easier than carrying it forward?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Becca found herself unable to answer it. She had spent so many years telling herself that her isolation was a choice, that she preferred solitude to the messy complications of human relationships. But sitting in her kitchen at dawn, watching a father keep vigil over his recovering son, she began to wonder if she had been lying to herself about what she actually wanted from life. "I should check on him," she said finally, standing up to avoid the intensity of Ahiga's gaze. But as she bent over Bidziel to check his breathing and temperature, she found herself thinking about the way the kitchen had felt during the night alive, with purpose and companionship in a way it hadn't been since William's death. The house had been just a shelter for 18 years, a place to eat and sleep between the real business of survival. Tonight, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, it had felt like a home. By full daylight, it was clear that Bidziel was well on his way to recovery. His fever was completely gone, his breathing was clear and strong, and he was sitting up in the improvised bed, looking around the kitchen with the bright curiosity of a child who was feeling better and wanted to explore his surroundings. "Can I see your ranch?" he asked Becca as she prepared a more substantial breakfast for all 3 of them. "My father says you have horses." "I do," Becca confirmed, feeling an unexpected warmth at his enthusiasm. 23 of them, plus about 200 head of cattle. 23 horses? Bidziel's eyes went wide. "Can I see them? I love horses. My father taught me to ride when I was little." Ahiga smiled at his son's excitement. "Perhaps Mrs. Stone is too busy for visitors. We should not impose on her hospitality. It's no imposition," Becca found herself saying, surprising them both. "After breakfast, if you're feeling strong enough, I'll show you around." The tour of the ranch became an adventure that stretched through the entire morning. Bidziel proved to be fascinated by everything: the windmill that pumped water from the deep well, the chicken coop where Becca kept a dozen hens, the vegetable garden where she grew beans and squash, and the medicinal herbs that had saved his life. But it was the horses that truly captured his imagination. Becca's herd was a mixture of working cow ponies and the larger draft animals she used for heavy ranch work, but they were all well-trained and gentle with children. Bidziel was fearless. Around them, approaching even the largest geldings with the confidence of someone who had grown up around horses. When Thunder, her statiest mount, nuzzled the boy's shoulder looking for treats, Bidziel laughed with pure delight. "He likes me," the child announced, stroking Thunder's nose with small, careful hands. "He has good judgment," Becca replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it. There was something about Bidziel that drew people and animals to him, a natural sweetness that hadn't been dimmed by illness or the hardships of his young life. Ahiga watched his son's interaction with the horses with obvious pride and relief. "It is good to see him laughing again," he said quietly to Becca as they stood by the corral fence. "He has been so serious since his mother died, carrying burdens that no child should have to bear. Children are resilient, Becca observed. More than adults sometimes. They know how to find joy, even in the middle of sorrow. Is that what you did when you were his age? Ahiga asked. The question caught Becca off guard. She thought back to her own childhood, trying to remember if she had ever possessed the kind of natural happiness that Bidziel displayed. I don't remember being particularly joyful as a child, she admitted. My family moved around a lot, following work. I learned early that it was easier not to get attached to places or people. And yet you married and built a life here, Ahiga pointed out. William was different, Becca said, her voice softening at the memory. He made me believe that putting down roots was possible, that love could be permanent even in an impermanent world. He was right, Ahiga said gently. Love is permanent. People die, but love continues. Becca looked at him sharply, but there was no reproach in his expression, only the kind of quiet understanding that came from someone who had wrestled with the same questions and come to different conclusions. How can you say that? She asked. Your wife is gone. My husband is gone. How is that permanent? Because it changed us, Ahiga replied simply. The love we shared with them became part of who we are. It influences every decision we make, every kindness we show, every moment of beauty we recognize. They are gone, but the love continues in us. As if to illustrate his point, Bidziel called out from the corral, Father, look. Thunder is letting me brush his mane. The pure joy in the child's voice was like sunlight breaking through clouds, and Becca found herself smiling despite the serious turn their conversation had taken. She would have loved to see him like this, Ahiga said, watching his son with obvious affection. Happy and healthy and full of wonder at the world. Every time I see him smile, I feel her joy too. Becca felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight bands of grief she had carried for so long. For the first time in 18 years, she began to consider the possibility that William's death didn't have to be the end of their story, that the love they had shared could continue to influence her life in positive ways rather than serving as a barrier against future happiness. We should head back, she said, suddenly needing to change the subject before it became too intense. Bidziel shouldn't overdo it on his first day of recovery, but as they walked back to the house, Becca found herself seeing her ranch through their eyes, not as a fortress against the world, but as a place where life could flourish, where healing could happen, where love could take root and grow. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she began to wonder what it would be like to share this place with people who appreciated its beauty and understood its possibilities. 3 days after Bidziel's fever broke, Becca found herself teaching the boy how to milk her 2 Jersey cows, a task that required patience and gentle hands. The child had recovered his strength with the remarkable speed of youth, and his curiosity about ranch life seemed boundless. Every morning he appeared at her elbow, eager to learn whatever she was willing to teach, his dark eyes bright with intelligence and enthusiasm. The secret is to be calm, Becca explained, demonstrating the proper technique while the cow, a gentle beast named Clementine, stood patiently in her stall. Cows can sense if you're nervous or in a hurry, and they won't cooperate with someone they don't trust. Bidziel nodded seriously, then placed his small hands where she showed him, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he attempted to master the rhythm of milking. At first, only a few drops appeared, but gradually he found the proper motion, and soon milk was streaming steadily into the pail. I did it, he exclaimed, his face lighting up with pride. Father, look. I'm milking a cow. Ahiga, who had been repairing a broken fence rail nearby, looked up with a smile that transformed his normally serious features. Very good, son. You are learning to be useful. The praise made Bidziel beam with happiness, and Becca found herself touched by the easy affection between father and son. It had been so long since she had witnessed the simple interactions of a loving family, that she had almost forgotten how natural and beautiful they could be. Over the following days, Ahiga proved himself invaluable around the ranch. He possessed the kind of practical intelligence that could look at a broken piece of equipment and intuitively understand how to fix it. And his experience with horses and cattle made him a natural partner in the daily work of maintaining the operation. More importantly, he never presumed upon her hospitality or tried to take charge of tasks she had been managing alone for years. "The windmill blade is cracked," he reported one morning, pointing to the mechanism that pumped water from the deep well. "If it breaks completely, you will lose your water supply until you can get a replacement from town." Becca climbed up to examine the damage, confirming what he had spotted from the ground. The metal blade had developed a hairline, crack that would only worsen with continued use. In town, a replacement would cost more than she could easily afford, and the wait for delivery could leave her without water for weeks. "I might be able to forge a new one," Ahiga suggested. "I worked as a blacksmith on the reservation before. My wife died. If you have iron stock and access to a forge, I could make something that would work until you can order a proper replacement." Becca stared at him in surprise. "You're a blacksmith?" "Among other things," Ahiga replied with a slight smile. "A man learns many trades when he has a family to support." The forge behind the house had not been used since William's death, but the tools and equipment were still there, protected from the elements by a roof of corrugated tin. Becca had kept it maintained out of habit, but she had never expected to need it again. Now, watching Ahiga examine the old anvil and bellows with professional interest, she realized how much of her husband's legacy she had simply abandoned rather than learning to use herself. "This is good equipment," Ahiga observed, testing the weight of a hammer. "Your husband knew his metalwork. He was better with iron than he was with cattle," Becca admitted. "Said he liked working with something that would hold its shape when you got it right." Ahiga smiled at that. "My father used to say the same thing. Iron is honest. It tells you immediately if your technique is flawed." By the end of the day, he had not only repaired the windmill blade, but had also fixed 3 broken horseshoes, straightened a bent gate hinge, and fashioned a new handle for a hoe that had been unusable for months. Watching him work, Becca realized how much she had been struggling with tasks that were simple for someone with the right skills and tools. On the 6th day of their stay, a dust cloud on the horizon announced the approach of visitors, something that happened so rarely at the stone ranch that Becca immediately reached for her rifle. Through her spyglass, she could see a wagon pulled by 2 mules, driven by a figure she recognized with mixed feelings, Ezra Polk, a traveling trader who made the circuit between the various settlements and ranches in the territory. "Trouble?" Ahiga asked, noting her tense posture. "Maybe," Becca replied, watching the wagon's slow progress up the canyon trail. "Ezra Polk is harmless enough, but he's the biggest gossip in 3 counties. Whatever he sees here today will be common knowledge from Flagstaff to Tucson by the end of the month." Ahiga considered this information seriously. "Would it be better if Bidzil and I were not visible when he arrives?" "Too late for that," Becca said, lowering the spyglass. "He's close enough to have seen us already. We'll just have to manage the situation as best we can." Ezra Polk was a small, wiry man in his 60s, with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that was never still. He climbed down from his wagon with the spry movements of someone who had spent his life traveling rough country, his gaze already taking inventory of everything he could see. "Miss Becca," he called out cheerfully, though his eyes were fixed on Ahiga and Bidzil with obvious curiosity. "Mighty fine day to find you entertaining guests. Don't believe I've had the pleasure," he added, extending a hand toward Ahiga. "Ezra Polk," Becca said reluctantly. "Meet Ahiga Bege and his son, Bidzil. They're staying here for a few days while the boy recovers from a fever." "Pleased to meet you both," Ezra said, shaking Ahiga's hand while studying his face with the intensity of someone committing details to memory. Navajo, are you? Long way from the reservation. We were traveling to relatives in New Mexico when my son became ill, Ahiga replied calmly. Mrs. Stone was kind enough to offer us shelter. That she was, Ezra agreed, though his tone suggested he was filing away. Every word for future reference. Miss Becca's always been generous to folks in need. Course, she don't usually have company out here. Gets mighty lonely, I imagine. Not particularly, Becca said firmly, recognizing the fishing expedition for what it was. I keep busy enough. With the ranch work? Oh, I'm sure you do, Ezra replied, his gaze wandering over the obviously well-maintained equipment and the subtle signs of recent repairs. Place is looking good. Better than it has in years, truth be told. You've been doing some fixing up? Maintenance never stops on a ranch this size, Becca replied evasively. Ezra nodded sagely, but she could see him cataloging the new fence rails, the repaired windmill, and the other improvements that Ahiga's presence had made possible. The trader's visit, which she had hoped to keep brief and unremarkable, was turning into exactly the kind of scrutiny she had been dreading. Well, Ezra said eventually, climbing back onto his wagon, I'd best be getting along. Still got 3 more stops before dark. You folks take care now. And Miss Becca, if you need anything from town, you just let me know. Always happy to help a neighbor. After the wagon had disappeared back down the canyon trail, Becca found herself pacing the porch with nervous energy. By tomorrow night, half the territory will know I've got a Navajo man and his son staying at my ranch, she said. People will talk. What will they say? Bidziel asked innocently. Becca looked at the child, realizing she couldn't explain the ugly prejudices and suspicions that would inevitably surface without destroying his trust in the basic goodness of people. Some folks don't understand that kindness doesn't depend on what someone looks like or where they come from, she said carefully. And those people are stupid, Bidziel declared with the blunt honesty of childhood. Bidziel, his father, said gently, it is not polite to call people stupid, even when they act foolishly. But they are being stupid, the boy insisted. You're the best person I know, and Mrs. Stone is kind and teaches me things. Why would anyone care what we look like? Ahiga and Becca exchanged a look over the child's head, both of them wishing the world was as simple and fair as it appeared. Through 8-year-old eyes. The innocence in Bidziel's voice was heartbreaking, knowing as they did that he would inevitably encounter the kind of prejudice that judged people by their ancestry rather than their character. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table after dinner, the weight of unspoken decisions hung heavy in the air. Bidziel had fully recovered his health and strength, and there was no medical reason for him and his father to remain at the ranch. The original plan had been for them to rest for one night and then continue their journey, but somehow a single night had stretched into a week, and none of them seemed eager to discuss their next move. We should talk about what comes next, Ahiga said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Bidziel is well now, and we have imposed on your hospitality long enough. You haven't imposed, Becca replied quickly, then felt her cheeks warm at how eager she sounded. I mean, you've more than earned your keep with all the work you've done around here, work that needed doing, Ahiga pointed out. This ranch is too much for one person to manage alone. The observation hung in the air like an invitation, though neither of them seemed willing to speak it aloud. Becca found herself thinking about the past week, about how much easier the daily routine had become with competent help, about how much more alive the ranch felt with the sounds of conversation and laughter echoing from the buildings. Where will you go? She asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. I am not certain, Ahiga admitted. The relatives we were traveling to see may not welcome us if they think Bidziel's illness was the white man's disease. There is still much fear about tuberculosis. Among our people, it wasn't tuberculosis, Becca said firmly. It was lung fever brought on by exposure and exhaustion. Completely different thing. You know that, and I know that, Ahiga replied. But fear does not always listen to medical facts, Bidziel, who had been listening to the adult conversation with growing concern, suddenly spoke up. "I don't want to leave," he announced. "I like it here. The horses know me now, and Mrs. Stone is teaching me to read her books, son," Ahiga said gently. "This is not our home. Mrs. Stone has her own life to live. But she's lonely," Bidziel insisted with the devastating directness that children specialized in. "She told me so when we were feeding the chickens. She said she hadn't realized how quiet it was here until we came to visit." Becca felt her face burn with embarrassment. She had made that observation during a moment of unguarded honesty, never expecting it to be repeated at such a crucial moment. "Bidziel, that was a private conversation," she said weakly. "But it's true, isn't it?" the boy pressed. "You are lonely, and we like being here. And my father is good at fixing things. Why can't we just stay?" The simple logic of childhood made the complex situation seem suddenly clear. Becca looked at Ahiga, seeing in his expression the same longing she felt, tempered by the practical concerns that adults learn to carry. He wanted to stay, she realized. He wanted it as much as she wanted them to remain. "It's not that simple," Ahiga said carefully. "There are things to consider. What would people say about a white woman living with a Navajo man and his child? The trader who visited today will spread stories, and some of those stories will not be kind. Let them talk," Becca said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I've been the subject of gossip before. When William died, half the territory had opinions about what I should do with my life, where I should live, who I should marry. I learned to ignore them then, and I can ignore them now. This would be different," Ahiga warned. "People can be cruel when they think someone is violating their expectations about how the world should work. Then we'll face that cruelty together," Becca replied, the words emerging before her cautious mind could stop them. "If we want to face it. If you want to stay." The kitchen fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of Bidziel's breathing as he waited for his father's response. Becca felt her heart hammering against her ribs, knowing that she had just taken a leap of faith that could change everything or leave her more isolated than ever. Ahiga was quiet for so long that Becca began to fear she had misread the situation entirely, that her offer had been presumptuous and unwelcome. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Once we make this choice, there will be no going back. People will assume things about our relationship that may not be true, and they will judge you for choices I have made. What people assume is their problem," Becca replied, though her voice shook slightly. "As for the relationship part, we can figure that out as we go. What matters is that this arrangement works for all of us, and that Bidziel has a stable home where he can grow up safely." Bidziel looked back and forth between the adults, reading the subtext of their conversation with the intuition that children often possessed. "Does this mean we can stay?" he asked hopefully. "If your father agrees," Becca said, meeting Ahiga's eyes across the table. "This ranch needs more than one person to run it properly, and I need more than just hired help. I need partners who understand that this land is something worth protecting and building on." "Partners," Ahiga repeated, as if testing the word. "Not employer and employee, partners," Becca confirmed. "Equal say in how things are run, equal share in whatever profits we can make, equal responsibility for the decisions that affect all of us." The offer was more generous than Ahiga had any right to expect, and they both knew it. A ranch the size of the Stone spread was worth a considerable fortune, and she was essentially offering to share ownership with people she had known for less than a week. But somehow, the arrangement felt right in a way that purely business relationships never did. "There is one thing," Ahiga said carefully. "My wife's grave is on the reservation, 3 days' ride from here. I would need to visit it sometimes to maintain it and to speak with her spirit." "Of course," Becca replied immediately. And if Bidzil wants to stay connected with his mother's people, we'll make sure that happens too. This doesn't have to mean cutting ties with your past. What about my father's people? Bidzil asked. Will I still be Navajo if I live with a white woman? The question revealed a complexity that none of them had fully considered. Bidzil was at an age where his cultural identity was still forming, and the choice to live away from the reservation would inevitably affect how he understood himself and his place in the world. You will always be Navajo, Ahiga said firmly. That is in your blood and in your heart, and no one can take it away from you. But you will also be other things, a rancher, a student, a young man who knows how to live in both worlds. Like you, Bidzil observed. Like me, his father. Agreed. It is not always easy, but it can be a strength if you let it be. Becca listened to this exchange with growing awareness of the responsibility she was taking on. By offering them a permanent home, she was not just gaining help with the ranch work, she was becoming part of Bidzil's upbringing, helping to shape the man he would become. It was a role she had never expected to play, and one that both thrilled and terrified her. So it's settled? She asked, needing to hear the words spoken aloud. It is settled, Ahiga replied, his voice carrying a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something deeper that might have been hope. We will stay, and we will build something together, Bidzil whooped with joy and ran around the table to hug both adults, his enthusiasm infectious enough to make them all laugh. For the first time in 18 years, Becca found herself thinking about the future, not as something to be endured, but as something to be created. The next morning brought their first test as a newly formed family unit. Becca was checking the cattle in the north pasture when she spotted riders approaching from the direction of Copper Creek, 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful pace of people who had business to conduct. Through her spyglass, she recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Tom Bradley, a decent man who tried to enforce the law fairly, but who was also sensitive to the political currents that could make his job difficult. She rode hard back to the ranch house, arriving just as Ahiga was emerging from the forge where he had been working on a new set of horseshoes. Company coming, she announced, swinging down from her horse. Sheriff Bradley and 2 deputies. This could be about Ezra Polk's visit yesterday. Ahiga nodded grimly, understanding immediately what the situation might entail. Should Bidzil and I make ourselves scarce? No, Becca said firmly. If we're going to make this work, we can't start by hiding. Whatever they have to say, we'll face it together. By the time the 3 riders reached the ranch yard, Becca and Ahiga were standing side by side on the porch, with Bidzil slightly behind them but clearly visible. Sheriff Bradley dismounted with the careful movements of a man who spent too many hours in the saddle, his expression neutral but his eyes alert. "Morning, Miss Stone," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I've had some folks express concern about your situation out here." "What kind of concern?" Becca asked, though she could guess the answer. "Well," Bradley said, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, "there's been talk about you harboring an Indian and his boy. Some folks think it might not be safe, a woman alone with strangers and all." "I'm hardly alone," Becca replied, gesturing toward Ahiga, "and they're not strangers anymore. This is Ahiga Bege and his son Bidzil. They're my new ranch partners." The word partners caused a stir among the 3 lawmen, and Becca could see them processing the implications of her statement. In the territorial legal system, business partnerships between whites and Indians were unusual but not illegal, though they were often viewed with suspicion by both communities. "Partners?" Bradley repeated. "You mean like hired hands?" "I mean like partners," Becca said firmly. "Equal partners in the operation of this ranch." One of the deputies, a younger man whose prejudices were written clearly on his face, stepped forward. "Miss Stone, are you sure you've thought this through? These people have ways that aren't like ours. You might find yourself in a situation you can't handle." "I can handle any situation that arises on my own land," Becca replied, her voice carrying the steel that had gotten her through 18 years of solitary survival. And I'll thank you not to make assumptions about people you don't know. Ahiga had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now he spoke with quiet dignity. Sheriff, if there are specific concerns about our presence here, I am willing to address them. We are law-abiding people who want only to work hard and live peacefully. Bradley studied Ahiga's face, clearly trying to gauge the man's character and intentions. There haven't been any specific complaints, he admitted. More like general uneasiness. Some folks remember the Apache troubles from a few years back, and they get nervous when they hear about Indians settling in the area. I'm not Apache, Ahiga pointed out reasonably. I'm Navajo, and I have no quarrel with anyone in this territory. My only concern is providing a good life for my son, and my only concern is running my ranch efficiently, Becca added, which I can do much better with competent help than I could alone. The sheriff was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his response carefully. Finally he said, I can't tell you who to associate with on your own land, Miss Stone, but I'd advise all of you to be careful about how you conduct yourselves in town. There are folks who might look for reasons to cause trouble, and it's easier to avoid problems than to solve them after they start. It was both a warning and a grudging acceptance, and Becca recognized it as the best outcome they could have. Hoped for under the circumstances. We appreciate the advice, Sheriff, she said. You can tell anyone who's concerned that the Stone Ranch is operating legally and peacefully, and that's all anyone needs to know about our business. After the lawman rode away, the three of them stood in the yard processing what had just occurred. It had been their first public test as a family unit, and while they had passed it, the experience had made clear that their arrangement would face ongoing scrutiny from people who didn't understand or approve of their choices. That went better than it could have, Ahiga observed. It's just the beginning, Becca replied. But we handled it together, and that's what matters. Bidziel, who had been unusually quiet during the confrontation, finally spoke up. Are people going to keep coming here to bother us? Maybe, Becca said honestly. But each time they do, we'll show them that we're exactly what we claim to be, a family working together to build something good. Eventually, they'll get tired of looking for problems that don't exist. As they walked back toward the house, Becca realized that the sheriff's visit had actually strengthened their resolve rather than weakening it. By facing external pressure, together, they had taken another step toward becoming the kind of family that could weather any storm. 2 months into their new arrangement, a lone rider appeared at the ranch during the dinner hour. Unlike previous visitors, this man came at dusk, materializing from the shadows between the canyon walls, like something conjured from the desert itself. Becca spotted him through the kitchen window, a tall figure on a paint horse, sitting motionless just beyond the gate as if studying the ranch buildings. There was something different about this visitor that made her hand move instinctively toward the rifle she kept by the door. We have company, she announced quietly. Single rider, just outside the gate. He's been watching us for several minutes. Ahiga moved to the window, his expression growing tense as he studied the stranger. I know him, he said after a moment. His name is Joseph Yazzie. He is my wife's brother. The revelation sent a chill through the kitchen. Bidziel looked up from his plate with sudden apprehension, clearly sensing the change in atmosphere. Is that good or bad? Becca asked, though Ahiga's expression had already given her an indication. It depends on why he has come, Ahiga replied carefully. Joseph opposed my marriage to his sister. He never accepted Bidziel as fully Navajo because of his mixed blood. Joseph Yazzie dismounted and walked toward the house with confident stride. He was younger than Ahiga, with the muscular build of someone who lived by physical labor. His clothes mixed traditional and contemporary buckskin leggings, cotton shirt, and a hat decorated with silver concos. Ahiga, he called out in English. I have come to talk with you about the boy. Ahiga stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between Joseph and the door. Joseph. It has been a long time. Not long enough, apparently, Joseph replied, his gaze taking in Becca and Bidziel in the doorway. I heard stories about where you had taken my nephew. I came to see if they were true. What stories? Ahiga asked. That you are living with a white woman. That you are allowing my sister's son to be raised outside his people's ways. The boy belongs with his mother's family, where he can learn to be Navajo. Bidziel stepped closer to Becca, instinctively seeking protection from the hostility radiating from his uncle. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Bidziel is with his father, Ahiga replied firmly. That is where he belongs. His father who has abandoned his heritage to play at being a white man. Joseph's contempt was evident. Look at yourself, brother. Where is the Navajo in you now? Uncle Joseph, Bidziel said suddenly, his young voice cutting through the tension. I remember you from before Mama died. You never wanted to hold me then either. The child's words carried devastating honesty, and Joseph's face darkened with something that might have been shame. You were too young to understand the situation. I understood that you made Mama cry, Bidziel replied fearlessly. She used to worry that you would try to take me away from Papa if something happened to her. Joseph looked genuinely taken aback, and for a moment his certainty wavered. But then his expression hardened again. The boy has been poisoned against his own family. No one has poisoned him against anything, Becca interjected. Bidziel speaks Navajo with his father every day. He knows his mother's stories, and he's proud of his heritage. But he also knows who has loved and protected him. Joseph's gaze fixed on her with undisguised hostility. The white woman speaks. For the boy now? Enough, Ahiga said, his voice carrying a warning. You will show respect in this house, or you will leave. Becca is family now, and she has done more for my son in 2 months than his mother's relatives did in 8 years. Family? Joseph repeated incredulously. You call a white stranger family while turning your back on blood relations? Blood relations who wanted nothing to do with a half-breed child, Ahiga replied, his patience exhausted. Blood relations who made it clear that Bidziel would never be fully accepted, no matter how hard he tried to prove himself worthy. Joseph's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. After a long moment of struggle, he spoke more softly. I made a promise to my sister before she died. I told her I would watch over her son, then keep that promise, Ahiga replied. Visit him, teach him what you think he should know. But do it as his uncle, not as someone trying to steal him away from the only stability he has known. You would allow this? Joseph asked, directing the question to Becca. You would welcome someone who has opposed this arrangement? Becca looked at Bidziel, who was watching with the intensity of someone whose future was being decided. Bidziel should know his uncle. He should understand all parts of his heritage. But any visits would need to be respectful of our family. You truly consider the boy your family? I consider both of them my family, Becca replied firmly. They saved me from a loneliness I didn't realize was killing me. We've built something here worth protecting. Joseph studied her face, trying to reconcile his preconceptions with reality. Finally, he turned to Ahiga. You have changed since our last meeting. There is something in your eyes that was not there when my sister died. There is hope, Ahiga replied simply. For the first time since we lost her, there is hope instead of just survival. Joseph knelt to eye level with his nephew. Are you well, boy? Are these people kind to you? They love me, Bidziel replied with simple honesty. Papa teaches me to work with iron, and Mrs. Stone teaches me to read and care for animals. I'm learning to be useful. And what about being Navajo? Papa tells me stories every night about our people. He teaches me our language and shows me how to make things the way his father taught him. I know who I am, Uncle Joseph. I just also know who I'm becoming. The wisdom in the child's words surprised Joseph. I would like to visit sometimes. To tell you stories about your mother that your father may not know. I would like that, Bedzil replied, then looked at Becca and Ahiga for confirmation. If it's all right, Ahiga said, relief evident. You should know your mother's family, even the difficult ones. Joseph actually smiled at that. I suppose I have been difficult. It is hard to accept change when you fear losing something precious. You're not losing anything, Becca said gently. Bedzil is gaining more family, more people who care about him. That can only make him stronger. As Joseph prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at the unlikely family. I will return in 1 month. I will bring stories about his mother's childhood. After he rode away, they stood processing what had occurred. They had faced their most serious challenge yet and emerged not just intact but stronger. That was well done, Ahiga said quietly. You showed him respect without backing down from our choices. I meant what I said about family. Becca replied, looking at both of them. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Bedzil slipped his hand into hers. Thank you for not letting him take me away. No one is taking you anywhere, Becca promised. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be, standing under the desert stars, with the warmth of their house glowing behind them. Becca realized she had finally found what she had been searching for without knowing it, a family bound not by blood or convention, but by choice and love and the shared commitment to build something lasting together. The first winter storm of the season arrived without warning in late November, sweeping down from the high country with a fury that reminded everyone why the desert could be as deadly as it was beautiful. Becca woke to the sound of wind howling through the canyon like a living thing, rattling the shutters and sending loose objects skittering across the ranch yard. By dawn, the temperature had dropped 30 degrees and snow was falling steadily. Unusual for their elevation, but not unheard of during particularly harsh winters. The cattle had sought shelter in the lee of the canyon walls, but several head were missing from the count, likely having wandered into arroyos where they could become trapped if the storm worsened. We need to find those missing steers before they freeze or fall into a washout, Becca announced over breakfast, pulling on her heaviest coat. In weather like this, we could lose half the herd if we're not careful. Ahiga was already preparing his gear, checking the condition of ropes and winter equipment they hadn't expected to need so early in the season. The storm is moving fast. We should split up to cover more ground, but stay within shouting distance of each other. I want to help, Bedzil announced, looking up from where he was feeding kindling to the fire. At 9 years old, he had grown considerably during his months at the ranch, gaining both physical strength and the kind of practical confidence that came from useful work. Too dangerous, Becca said automatically, then paused as she saw the disappointed look on his face. The boy had proven himself capable and reliable in many situations, and keeping him safely inside while the adults faced the storm felt both protective and insulting to his growing maturity. He could stay with one of us, Ahiga suggested carefully. 3 pairs of eyes are better than 2, and he knows the cattle as well as we do now. After a moment's hesitation, Becca nodded. You're right. But he stays close, and if the weather gets worse, we bring him back immediately. The search took them into parts of the ranch they rarely visited during normal operations, rocky areas where cattle sometimes wandered when seeking shelter from wind and weather. The snow was falling more heavily now, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 yards and making it difficult to spot the dark shapes of cattle against the winter landscape. They found the first group of missing steers huddled in a natural cave formation about 2 miles from the main buildings. The animals were cold but unharmed, and relatively easy to drive back toward the ranch once they were motivated to move. But 3 head were still unaccounted for, including a prize bull that represented a significant portion of their breeding stock. There, Bedzil called out, pointing toward a narrow draw that cut between 2 rock formations. I can see something moving down there. Ahiga peered through the swirling snow and confirmed the sighting. It's the bull and 2 cows. They're trapped in the arroyo, but they look to be in good condition. The rescue required careful planning. The arroyo was perhaps 15 feet deep with steep sides, and the cattle had apparently fallen in while seeking shelter from the wind. Getting them out would require ropes and a good deal of coordination between the 3 rescuers. "I'll go down and get ropes around them," Ahiga volunteered, studying the terrain. "Becca, you and Bidziel can manage the horses from up top to pull them out." "Wait," Becca said, something about the situation nagging at her experienced eye. "Look at how they're standing. That bull isn't just cold, he's favoring his left front leg. If he's injured, trying to haul him up those walls could make it worse." She was right. The bull, normally an imposing and energetic animal, was clearly in distress beyond what the weather would cause. His breathing was labored, and he kept shifting his weight away from the injured leg. "We need to get down there and assess the damage before we try to move him," Becca decided. "If his leg is broken, we might have to find another way." The descent into the arroyo was treacherous, with loose rock made slippery by the accumulating snow. But once they reached the bottom, the extent of the problem became clear. The bull had apparently slipped on the steep walls while trying to climb out, wrenching his shoulder and possibly cracking ribs in the fall. "He's hurt bad," Ahiga confirmed after a careful examination. "But I don't think anything is broken. More likely pulled muscles and bruising. He might be able to walk out if we can find a gentler slope. There's a place about a quarter-mile downstream where the banks are lower," Bidziel suggested. "I found it last month when I was exploring. We could lead them there instead of trying to pull them straight up." It was a good suggestion, but it meant driving 3 injured and frightened animals through deepening snow to a location that might or might not be accessible in current conditions. The alternative was leaving them in the arroyo overnight, where they would certainly freeze if the temperature continued to drop. "We try for the gentle slope," Becca decided. "But we do it now, before the storm gets worse." The next hour was among the most challenging any of them had ever experienced. Driving injured cattle through snow while fighting wind and limited visibility required every bit of skill and patience they could muster. The bull, in particular, seemed determined to lie down and give up, forcing them to constantly encourage him forward. But Bidziel proved to be the key to their success. His smaller size allowed him to get close to the animals without threatening them, and his patient, gentle manner seemed to calm their fears. When the bull finally balked completely, refusing to take another step, it was the boy who found the right combination of coaxing and pressure to get him moving again. "Easy, big fellow," he murmured, stroking the animal's neck while positioning himself to block any retreat. "We're almost there. Just a little further and you'll be warm and safe." The gentler slope, when they finally reached it, proved to be exactly what they needed. The cattle were able to walk out of the arroyo under their own power, and though the bull was clearly exhausted, he was no longer in immediate danger. By the time they drove the recovered cattle back to the main ranch buildings, the storm had intensified to the point where visibility was almost zero. Snow was falling so heavily that they could barely see from one building to the next, and the wind had picked up enough to make standing upright a challenge. "Get the animals into the barn," Becca shouted over the howling wind. "We'll sort out the injuries once everyone is under cover." The barn, built to withstand desert storms, provided blessed relief from the wind and snow. In the relative quiet, they were able to properly examine the bull's injuries and confirm that, while painful, they were not life-threatening. With rest and proper care, he would make a full recovery. "That was well done," Ahiga said as they worked together to make the injured animals comfortable. "All of us. We worked as a team out there." Bidziel was the hero, Becca observed, watching the boy carefully apply liniment to the bull's sore shoulder. "That animal would never have moved for us adults. It took someone he trusted to get him going again." The praise made Bidziel glow with pride, but he tried to downplay his contribution. "I just talked to him like Mama used to talk to me when I was scared." Sometimes being gentle works better than being strong. The simple wisdom of the statement struck both adults powerfully. In the crisis they had seen not just Bedziel's growing competence, but his developing character, the kind of person he was becoming under their care and guidance. As the storm raged outside, the three of them settled into the comfortable routine of evening chores, feeding animals and checking equipment, while the barn provided sanctuary from the weather. There was something deeply satisfying about working together in the face of natural challenges, about succeeding through cooperation and mutual support. Storms like this used to terrify me, Becca admitted as they prepared to make the dash back to the house. When I was alone, every crisis felt like it might be the one I couldn't handle by myself. And now? Ahiga asked. Now I know I'm not alone, she replied simply. Whatever comes, we face it together, the statement carried weight beyond the immediate situation. Over the months they had been together, they had gradually evolved from a temporary arrangement into something much deeper, a family in the truest sense, bound together by shared challenges, mutual respect, and growing love. The storm should blow itself out by tomorrow, Ahiga predicted, studying the sky through the barn door. But we'll need to check all the animals and repair whatever damage the wind has done. Together, Bedziel added, and the word carried all the confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. As they ran through the swirling snow toward the warm lights of the house, Becca reflected on how much had changed since that first night when Ahiga had appeared at her gate carrying a sick child. The desert that had once seemed like a harsh and lonely place now felt like home in a way it never had when she lived there alone. The storm might rage outside, but inside the house there would be warmth and laughter, shared stories, and comfortable silences. There would be the quiet satisfaction of work done well and challenges met successfully. Most importantly, there would be the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as a family. The wind howled through the canyon with renewed fury, but inside the adobe walls of the stone ranch, three people who had found each other against all odds settled in to wait out the storm, secure in the knowledge that some bonds are strong enough to weather any tempest. Spring came to the high desert with the gentle persistence of hope itself, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost magical. The winter storms had left the canyon walls streaked with mineral deposits that caught the morning light like veins of silver, and wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion wherever water had collected during the wet months. Becca stood on the porch in the pre-dawn quiet, watching the sun paint the eastern rim of the canyon in shades of gold and rose. In her hands, she held a letter that had arrived with yesterday's supply wagon, its official seal and formal language representing a challenge she had been dreading for months. "You're up early," Ahiga observed, emerging from the barn where he had been checking on a mare that was due to foal any day. "Trouble sleeping?" "The territorial government wants to conduct a census," Becca replied, holding up the letter. "They're sending an inspector next month to verify property ownership and record the details of every household in the territory." The implications hung unspoken between them. Their unconventional family arrangement had been accepted by locals through a combination of respect for Becca's reputation and the practical benefits their partnership brought to the community. But territorial officials might view their situation through the lens of legal precedent and social convention. What exactly are they looking for? Ahiga asked, settling into the chair beside her. Property deeds, tax records, proof of legal residence. They also want to document the composition and character of each household. She read directly from the letter. All adult residents must provide documentation of their legal status and their relationship to the property owner. The morning breeze carried the scent of blooming sage and the distant sound of Bedziel singing to himself as he performed his morning chores. The normalcy of the scene stood in sharp contrast to the uncertainty that the letter represented. "We knew this day would come eventually," Ahiga said quietly. "The question is how we want to handle it." Before Becca could respond, Bedziel appeared around the corner of the house, leading the milk cow toward the barn with the confident competence he had developed over their months together. At 10 years old, he moved with the easy grace of someone who had found his place in the world, his face bright with the particular contentment that came from useful work and unconditional love. "Morning, Mama Becca," he called out cheerfully, using the name that had evolved naturally over the winter months. "Clementine's in a good mood today. I think she's happy about the warm weather." The casual endearment, which had initially made Becca uncomfortable, now filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sunrise. Somewhere during the long months of shared challenges and daily companionship, she had stopped being Mrs. Stone and had become something far more precious, family in the truest sense of the word. Later that morning, as they worked together to repair winter damage to the fence lines, Becca broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind since the letter's arrival. "There might be a way to make our situation legally unassailable," she said carefully. "But it would require some significant changes." Ahiga paused in his work, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to propose. "What kind of changes?" "I could legally adopt Bidziel," Becca said, the words coming out in a rush. "And we could formalize your status as a business partner through incorporation papers. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would give us legal standing that would be difficult for territorial officials to challenge." The suggestion hung in the air between them, laden with implications that went far beyond simple paperwork. Legal adoption would make Bidziel officially her son, while business incorporation would establish Ahiga as an equal partner rather than a hired hand or dependent. "You would do that?" Ahiga asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You would take on the legal responsibility for my son?" "I've already taken on the emotional responsibility," Becca replied. "The legal part would just make it official. But it's not a decision I can make alone. It affects all of us." They called Bidziel over and explained the situation in terms he could understand, watching his face carefully for any sign of confusion or reluctance. But the boy's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "You mean you would really be my mama?" he asked, his eyes bright with hope. "Not just Mama Becca, but really truly my mama?" "If that's what you want," Becca said, her throat tight with emotion, "it would mean that legally, officially, you would be my son. Rebecca Stone would be your mother, not just the woman who takes care of you." "Yes," Bidziel said without hesitation. "Yes, I want that more than anything." The simple certainty in his voice dissolved any lingering doubts Becca might have had. This child, who had come to her as a stranger's dying son, had become as precious to her as any child of her blood could have been. Making their relationship legal would simply acknowledge what her heart had known for months. "Then we'll need to make a trip to the territorial capital," Ahiga said practically. "Adoption papers and incorporation documents both require filing with the territorial secretary. It's a hard journey," Becca warned. 3 days each way, and we'd need to stay in Santa Fe for at least a week to complete all the paperwork. "I've never been to a real city," Bidziel said excitedly. "Will there be buildings taller than our barn? And stores where you can buy anything you want?" His enthusiasm was infectious, and Becca found herself looking forward to the trip despite the challenges it would present. "There will be buildings 3 stories tall," she promised. "And stores full of things you've never seen before." The trip to Santa Fe proved to be everything Bidziel had imagined and more. The territorial capital, with its adobe buildings and bustling plaza, seemed like a different world compared to the isolated beauty of their desert ranch. The boy pressed his face to the hotel window each morning, watching the street vendors and merchants begin their daily commerce. The legal proceedings were complex but straightforward. Becca's reputation as a successful rancher, combined with Ahiga's obvious competence and Bidziel's clear happiness, made the adoption process remarkably smooth. The territorial judge, a practical man who cared more about the child's welfare than social convention, signed the papers with barely a question. "You understand," he said to Becca as the documents were finalized, "that this makes you fully responsible for the boy's upbringing, education, and welfare. In the eyes of the law, he will be your son in every respect." "I understand," Becca replied, watching Bidziel carefully sign his own name to the adoption papers with the intense concentration of someone performing the most important act of his young life. "And I accept that responsibility gladly." The business incorporation took longer, requiring detailed documentation of the ranch's assets and the specific terms of their partnership. But when the final papers were signed and filed, Ahiga owned a full third of the Stone Ranch operation, with legal rights and responsibilities equal to Becca's own. "We're really partners now," he said as they walked back to their hotel through the warm evening air of the capital. "Equal partners in everything. We were always partners," Becca replied. "This just makes it official." That night, as they celebrated with dinner at Santa Fe's finest restaurant, Bidziel raised his glass of milk and a toast. "To our family," he said solemnly. "The best family in the whole territory. To our family," Becca and Ahiga replied in unison. And the words carried the weight of promises kept and dreams fulfilled. The journey back to the ranch felt different than their departure had, marked by a sense of completion and belonging that transformed the familiar landscape into something new. They were returning not as three people sharing a temporary arrangement, but as a legally recognized family with all the rights and responsibilities that status entailed. "Look," Bidziel called out as they crested the final ridge before descending into their hidden valley. "You can see the windmill from here. And the barn roof. We're almost home." Home. The word carried more meaning now than it ever had before. This was not just the place where they lived, but the place where they belonged, where their roots had grown deep enough to weather any storm. The ranch buildings looked exactly as they had left them, but somehow everything seemed different through the lens of their new legal status. The corrals where Bidziel had learned to handle horses, the forge where Ahiga had taught him metalworking, the kitchen where Becca had nursed him back to health. All of it was now officially theirs in a way that no outside authority could challenge. The territorial inspector will find everything in perfect order when he arrives, Becca observed with satisfaction as they unloaded their travel gear. Legal documents, clear ownership, and a family that anyone would be proud to claim. That evening, as they sat around the familiar kitchen table, sharing stories of their adventure in the capital, Becca reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a lonely widow convinced that isolation was the only safety. Now she was the mother of a remarkable boy and the partner of a man whose quiet strength had become the foundation of her new life. "Do you ever regret it?" Ahiga asked suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Giving up your solitude for all the complications that come with family?" Becca looked around the kitchen that had once echoed with emptiness and now hummed with conversation and laughter. She thought of the mornings when Bidziel's chatter woke her earlier than she had planned, of the evenings when Ahiga's presence turned simple meals into celebrations, of the way their voices filled spaces that had been silent for too long. "Never," she said firmly, "not for a single moment." The woman who lived alone here was surviving. The woman who lives here now is living outside. The desert wind moved through the canyon with its eternal voice, but inside the adobe walls of the stone ranch, a family that had chosen each other settled into the comfortable rhythms of their shared life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but they would face them together, secure in the knowledge that some bonds are strong enough to transform even the loneliest heart into a home. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed Becca's long years of solitude and now watched over her newfound happiness. In the end, the greatest rescue had not been Bidziel's recovery from illness, but the healing of three wounded hearts that had found in each other the family they had all been searching for without knowing it.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.